Very good evening, everyone. I want to go ahead and echo what's already been said and just say I'm very thankful that you are here. Thank you for making it a priority to be out here on a Monday night like tonight. I'm sure for many of you today was a busy day for a variety of reasons, whether it was work or family things going on, but you are still here tonight, and I really do appreciate that, and I know a lot of people here do as well. So thank you. Back in the 1960s, there was a research study that was done that involved preschoolers and sweet treats. And the sweet treat in question in this research study was a marshmallow research study. Perhaps some of you have even heard of this study before. I had to take a lot of different psychology classes in high school and college, and this research study kept being brought up time and time again, and we would read things about it, and we would watch videos about it. And if you don't know what the marshmallow research study was, there were these groups of researchers that got these preschool-aged toddlers and would take them into a room and sit them down at a table, and they would put a marshmallow in front of them, and they said, all right, if you can wait 15 minutes, you can get a second marshmallow. And obviously 2 is better than 1, so they all waited for the second marshmallow, right? Now, if you have any kids that age, then you probably know exactly what happened. Most of them ate that first marshmallow, and it didn't take them very long to do so either. If you watch the video of this happening, it was pretty hilarious. Some of them were really struggling with this decision before. I mean, they would put their hands over their eyes or turn around in their chairs, just kind of squirming in their seats. It was kind of torture for them to hold out for any period of time. In fact, some of them were even a little bit devious about it. They would take the marshmallow and eat the inside of it because they thought no camera was watching them. And then they would put it back on the table thinking they'd still get the second marshmallow. So little devious tykes at that age already, little smart ones. But most of them just went ahead and ate the first marshmallow. And you might look at that and say, well, that's not a very impressive study because that's exactly what you would expect to happen. Just says something about kids that age and their patience levels, which they have no patience levels. So that's not too impressive. But what really made this study so interesting is that years later down the road, those same researchers went back to those same kids and started to observe where they were at in their life. And they noticed some really interesting trends. They noticed that those who had held out for the second marshmallow, the few of them who had done that, were at, by all objective standards, a much better spot. They had, on average, much higher test scores throughout their schooling career. They had much lower levels of anxiety and depression. They were more sociable in general, less likely to be given in to drugs or alcohol, to ever have to go through addictions like that. They were just a lot more successful, just at a much better spot. And really, it all goes back to that initial character quality that they showed with that marshmallow research study. And what character quality was that, would you say? Be self-control. And that's what we're going to spend some time talking about here this evening. Having self-control as a disciple, which is really difficult. And for many of us, we would have been that first marshmallow kid. So I think it's something that we ought to talk about because the Bible has a lot to say about self-control. In Proverbs chapter 25, verse 28, it says, like a city that is broken into and without walls is a man who has no control over his spirit. So basically, a person who doesn't have self-control is always subject to attack, to defeat, to having their spiritual walls broken into without any sort of defense. And so if that's true, if the wise proverb writers would say something like that, then we need to talk about how we can be better disciples of self-control. So the way I'm going to approach this topic is thinking first off about generally what does the Bible have to say about self-control as a concept, maybe think about certain definitions, how we should look at it, but then also spending a moment talking about some of the common struggles and problems that we have in our time of dealing with self-control before kind of wrapping it up with what I hope will be very practical solutions for being better disciples of self-control. So I hope it'll be helpful to go through some of those things. But thinking about self-control as a concept and starting to form maybe some definitions of what exactly that means, there have been many different examples or definitions given over time for what this concept is all about. At one point in times past, a Fuller Seminary school said that self-control is an instrumental virtue. It facilitates the acquisition and development of other virtues, joy, gratitude, generosity, etc. And to boil that down to a lot simpler English, basically self-control is a connecting character attribute. It doesn't just stand alone by itself, but it is involved in any other sort of attribute that would be involved in the life of a Christian or a disciple. But a definition that's even simpler than that I really like is that self-control is doing the right thing even when you don't feel like it. I really like that one because I really relate to that one. Because there have been many times where I have not, from my own senses or desires, felt like doing the right thing. It was hard, and sometimes we just give in to those things. But self-control is the character quality that bypasses your current circumstances, your physical emotions or desires or thoughts, and makes the right decision anyway. And if you start to think about it that way, all of a sudden you can see how it applied to so many different areas. And I'll just throw up a few different examples on the board here. Take anger. Self-control being involved in you getting angry. Because guess what? There are going to be things and people that get you riled up in life. Maybe on the way here you had someone that cut in front of you on the road, and that naturally makes us emotional and feel certain things, and self-control is able to kind of calm that down and not act in a rash way. The self-control is involved in so many different areas: food, entertainment, exercise. And some of these things are not actually bad in and of themselves. Like, we need food to eat and to survive and to sustain our lives. And we need certain things to even occupy our time sometimes that are not that bad of things. But self-control is involved in each one of them. And it absolutely is a spiritual principle. If you will, open up your Bibles to Galatians chapter 5 with me. Galatians chapter 5, we're going to read from Paul's famous list, the fruits of the Spirit. Galatians chapter 5, you can look down to verse 22. It says, "The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. And those who are Christ's have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit." So there you have it. As part of this famous list of the fruit of the Spirit, you have self-control. And maybe you've even had it pointed out to you before that when you look at certain biblical lists like this, the order of the words sometimes matters. If you take the first one in this list, well, love, obviously, I don't even have to talk about how important that one is. But then at the very end, the last one, the bookend, self-control. Almost like self-control connects to everything that was just said up until that point. I don't know if that was on purpose, if there's anything there, but when I look at all of these fruits of the Spirit, self-control is involved in each one of them. But Paul didn't just talk about this in terms of a general principle. Now, this is something that he personally understood and worked with in his life. If you look back in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul is using this illustration of his life like a race. He was someone that really liked to use athletic imagery to talk about the race of life. Now, I want to read a couple of these verses at the end of 1 Corinthians 9. It says, starting in verse 24, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. Everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. Thus I fight, not as one who beats the air. But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest, when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." So he talks about temperance, about this race that he's running and how he does that. And I'm reading from the New King James Version, but if you have a New American Standard, it will use this phrase: this person exercises self-control. And I really like that analogy, because self-control is an exercise. It is like a muscle, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on. But Paul saw the importance on a personal level of exercising temperance or self-control or discipline as he goes throughout his own race. But let me show you one more list. If you will, flip over to 2 Peter now. Peter has his own impressive list. That's almost like the fruit of the Spirit, but slightly different. Over in 2 Peter chapter 1, I'm going to start reading in verse 2 if you're following along. 2 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 2, it says, "Grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord, as his divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue, by which have been given to us exceedingly great and precious promises, that through these you may be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. But also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, to perseverance godliness, to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love." So smack dab in the middle of Peter's list, self-control, surrounded by things such as faith and kindness and love and all these amazing qualities. And Peter was someone that understood what it was like to struggle with self-control from time to time, didn't he? But he's come to the point now where he's matured a little bit, he's grown up. He includes self-control in this list, and he connects it to what he just said in the beginning, such as in verse 4, that as a part of having these qualities, you are literally partaking in the divine nature. That's kind of crazy to think about. Or if you keep going after this list in verse 8, if you have something like self-control, then you will neither be barren nor unfruitful. So those are very positive images associated with having something like self-control. And you could read many other examples, just one more. Proverbs 16:32, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city." When we have self-control, we are better and stronger than a man who can take on a whole city by himself, because we are able to stop the attacks of the devil. And that's pretty impressive to be able to do. But as much as the Bible will talk about self-control and having it in a positive light, if you think about the flip side, what happens when you don't have self-control? I just want to show you one verse. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. That's about as straightforward as you can get, isn't it? If you live according to the flesh, in other words, if you live without having self-control, then that's what's awaiting each one of us. And I don't want that. Self-control undoubtedly is one of the most difficult aspects of Christianity and of being a disciple. It is something that I am not close to mastering, and it's something that I still have a lot of work to do on. And that's partly because there are a lot of problems, a lot of challenges when it comes to having self-control on a consistent basis. I just want to briefly speak about a couple of those for just a moment. You've heard it said, I'm sure, many times, the cliche statement, first step to solving a problem is recognizing that there is one. And that's really how I started off yesterday morning's lesson. Disciples recognizing their need for God and His Son. Well, if we are going to effectively combat and have solutions for self-control, we need to see what exactly the problems are in our times. I'll just start off generally with saying self-control has always been a human problem, because when you look at our day, there are prisons that are full of people who at one very important moment failed to have self-control. And so they wound up in that situation. Or courts are full of couples who at least one of them at some major point failed at having self-control. And so you see that in our age, how there's always problems. But if you go back to even the early time period of the Bible, it was still there. It was still a struggle for them. I'll just flash up a couple of examples. Saul and David, I'm going to talk about them a little bit more tomorrow night, so I won't say much about them right now. But one of the stories that resonates a lot with me is the story of Esau. And I just want to briefly read that back in Genesis, if you want to follow along. Genesis chapter 25. I can't really relate to throwing a spear at someone like Saul did, but I think I can relate just a little bit to Esau. Genesis chapter 25, I'm going to start reading in verse 29. It says here that Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. Esau said to Jacob, "Please, feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary." And therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, "Well, sell me your birthright as of this day." And Esau said, "Look, I am about to die, so what is this birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me as of this day." And he did. He swore to him. He sold his birthright to Jacob, and Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils. So he ate and drank, arose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. You ever been hungry before? That's the wrong question. Have you ever been really, really, really hungry before? Maybe some of you have been in that position. It seems that Esau was that way, really, really hungry. I mean, he must have been because he gave up his birthright, which, if you're putting that on the market, wouldn't really equate to a bowl of stew. I think it'd be worth a little bit more than that. But Esau, in this moment, decided to give up something that was so much more valuable for something momentary, for something to fill up his stomach. Have you ever been Esau before? Now, maybe it wasn't food, maybe it wasn't a stew, but have you been in that position where you couldn't really control yourself, and so you gave up something far more valuable for something temporary, for something in the moment? It has always been a human struggle going all the way back to the beginning. But for all of us that live here today in our times, there are some things that make it, I would say, extra difficult. Some modern day distractions that come our way. And I'll just simplify it and say technology, although technology just is in reference to things advancing in whatever culture or time. But in our time, sin is more accessible than it ever has been in all of human history. Now, let me just make it very clear. Technology does not call sin. And throughout human history, if you wanted to sin, you would find a way to do that, no matter how much access you had. But we have to acknowledge the elephant in the room. What's in our pockets right now gives us access to the entire world and everything that the world has to offer. And there's a lot of not good stuff out there. We get on social media and we have algorithms that push to us exactly what it knows we want to see. Or the internet will float to us different articles that it knows is going to be divisive and get people riled up and fussing at each other online. Yeah, it knows what's going to get the clicks. Yeah, we have a lot of modern day distractions to deal with, so that's something we need to acknowledge and think about if that's our problem. Or maybe one of our problems we have to deal with, I'll simplify it like this: the excuses that society will tell you, or the mindset that our culture will tell you. And here is the prevailing mindset. Freedom is found in giving in to your desires. If you want true freedom, if you want true liberty, then the way that you access that is doing whatever you want. We call it self-expression. Just express yourself, and however you're feeling, go for it, and that's freedom. No, that's a lie. That's a lie. No, that is actually slavery to the highest degree. In Romans 6:16, it says, "Do you not know that to whom you present yourselves slaves to obey, you are that one slaves whom you obey, whether of sin leading to death or of obedience leading to righteousness?" You are going to serve something. Like, there's just no getting around that. We are going to serve something. It's just that some people have taken the concept of freedom and made that their idol, that my personal freedom is what I am going to serve and be a slave to. That's what a lot of people fall into. Other excuses that you will encounter in relation to this topic is self-control is too hard, and if I feel a certain way, like if God made me a certain way in my nature, well, I can't help that. God just wants me to feel who I am and wants me to be happy, so I'm just going to do that. Or I'll figure it out later. I got time, I'll grow up eventually, and then I'll get self-control, but I'm just going to sow my wild oats now, or whatever it said. How often does that actually work out? That's usually not too effective of a mindset, is it? No, don't give in to culture's mentality. That is a problem. Last one I'll mention, and to me, I think this is the biggest one. One of the biggest problems of self-control is that we think we can master it all by ourselves. We think we can do it alone. And I have been in that boat time and time again. And this is normally what it looks like. All right, I have a certain temptation, certain problem, or struggle with self-control. And so I tell myself, when the moment comes, when that challenge, that struggle, that temptation rears its ugly head, I'm just going to say no. Like, I'm just going to be strong enough in the moment and withstand whatever it is Satan's throwing my way, and I'll get by it. I'll just be good enough and strong enough, and that doesn't work either. Maybe the first time you get past it, you're strong enough. No. And maybe you can even do that a couple more times, but how consistent are you if that's what you are relying on? When I get into the moment, I'm just going to say no, and it'll be okay. No, we might call that using our willpower. And if we were to give a definition of willpower, we would say the emotional energy needed to withstand temptation. And a lot of us try to rely on willpower without realizing that this emotional energy is a finite resource, meaning it is limited. It runs out. You do not have an unending supply of this strong emotional energy to combat temptation time and time again. Humans just are not built that way. I'm going to come back to this willpower thing a little bit later on, but just hold this in mind right now. As I said, the reason that I bring up these different problems is not to be depressing or to say that we can't do it or just focus on the negative, but to recognize the different ways that we struggle and to see, am I having a problem with any one of these? Is there some sort of distraction or some mentality that I'm giving into or just trying to figure it out by myself? If you find yourself in any one of these, hopefully that could be a wake-up call. But thankfully, there are a lot of different solutions when it comes to having self-control. That's what we're going to spend the rest of our time this evening talking about. First off, recognize that having self-control is absolutely possible. One, because God has said so. God says over in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 that no temptation has overtaken you except that which is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. That's a promise. God has said, you do not have impossible tasks put before you. There is a way of escape. You actually have to look for it, though, and He provides that way. So God says it's possible, but another one that should hit close to home for everyone is that you've done it before. You have been successful. Every single person in this room right now has been successful at some point in having self-control, even in difficult moments when you did not feel like it. Whenever I was growing up and August came around, I knew that the new school year was right around the corner, and you start thinking about that more and more as the days come on. And as I was rising up in grades, that was something that I would get excited about. Maybe there are some different nerves, especially leading up to the first day of school. And so as a kid, you have to get up early, whatever time your alarm needs to go off. And I can remember that first day of school. That alarm went off, and I got up, and I turned it off. and I went about my day, and I didn't need Mom to come and drag me out of bed because I was excited about the first day of school, and I was thinking about it and ready to dive into it. I was motivated to get up and get going. Or as you get older, when it comes to a first-time job, you don't sleep in. No, that first day, you're up, you're at 'em, you're thinking about it, you're excited. You don't have to have someone to just keep prodding you along because you have a certain motivation or purpose to go out and get it going, whatever it is. So we've had those experiences before, but the problem is that over time, our motivation starts to wane, and so you know what happens? All of a sudden, that snooze button looks a lot more appealing. And it's a lot harder to get out of bed and get going sometimes because the motivation isn't quite the same as it once was. But let me use another example that should really hit close to home considering what we're doing right now. There have been probably some moments across your life where you have sat in an audience like this, listening to a lesson such as this one, and you've probably thought along the way, all right, this guy's been going, 25, 30 minutes at this point, and I'm kind of ready for him to be over with this lesson. You know, if it's the morning time, I'm ready for lunch to come, or maybe you haven't eaten dinner yet, and you're still waiting on that one, and you're getting a little bit hungry. Oh, and the preacher said like one last point, like 3 last points ago, and he's still going. And to top it off, the lesson kind of stinks anyways. I don't really like it, and I keep having to sit here and listen to it. You ever felt those ways before? Hopefully not right now, but I've been there, I think. But you tell you what, I never once in my entire life, gone to church my entire life, never once have I seen someone stand up in the audience and say, will you just hush up already so we can go home and eat and your lesson stinks? I've never heard that before, even though it might have been going through some people's minds. Why didn't you say that? Because your motivation to perhaps show respect to the preacher, or your motivation to not lose respect amongst your peers, maybe that took precedence to what you were feeling in the moment. So you just waited for the car ride home to say it to your spouse afterwards. But we understand, and we have been successful if we have had the right motivation or the right purpose before. And I think that is a critical factor, having the right purpose. Some of you here, no doubt, have heard of that guy, I think Simon Sinek, guy who did that TED Talk about the why question. How that's the most important question for a corporation to ask itself, most important question on an individual level. Why am I doing what I'm doing? And if I have that one figured out, the what, the how, those things will kind of work themselves out along the way. And I think there's a lot of validity to it. So what is your purpose? Well, there's a lot of different things that you could say. What would be a good purpose statement? Well, maybe in the words of Jesus, you could say, my purpose is to love God and to love God's people. And that's how I'm going to think about my motivation. Or maybe my purpose is the idea that Paul brings out in Philippians 3, of forgetting those things which lie behind and reaching forward to those things that lie ahead. My eyes are on the prize. However you want to define it, having a purpose or a motivation is going to be crucial. And that's something that's been studied at many different points. This University of Oregon psychologist once said that there is a deep connection between identity and motivation. A behavior that holds greater subjective value for a person will be relatively easy for them to complete versus tasks of lesser significance. These identity-linked goals are more likely to be successful. Basically, what he's saying is it is much easier to pursue and to meet a goal when you have a purpose attached, a motivation attached that aligns with your identity, with who you are. And that's something that we talked about yesterday morning, about the new identity that we have with Jesus Christ. And if that's true, if that's how we see ourselves, if that's how we define ourselves, then our motivation, our purpose can be connected to that, and it's going to make this entire area a lot easier to approach, a lot easier to reach that goal. So, having the right purpose, really important. Another one, draw bright lines. Just out of curiosity, has anyone ever heard that phrase before? I didn't think so. Draw bright lines is usually a legal term to define a clearly specified courtroom ruling or standard, or in other words, specific restrictions that you do not go outside the bounds of. Think about it just like you're driving down the road and you have bright yellow lines that show you the parameters of the road and where you can drive. So draw bright lines or have specific restrictions in regards to the different areas of self-control that you might struggle with. Because one of the biggest challenges or problems that I see from people is that when they are trying to change, trying to get better in whatever area that it is, they are much too vague about mapping out exactly what's going to change. And the biggest example of this is every single year when January 1st rolls around, and everyone comes along and says, all right, I want to lose weight. I want to eat better. I want to eat healthier. Just want to be better in that regard. And how often does that work out for most people? Maybe for a week or two, you eat a little healthier or whatever. But by the time January ends, it's exactly the way it was when December 31st hit. Same thing. That's because when people say, I want to eat healthier, what in the world does that even mean? Like, what does that look like practically? Because what will happen is that people will be thinking about it and stressing about it, and then they'll come to a decision in their day and see that good-looking piece of pie on the table, and they think, oh, should I eat that or not? Or how much have I eaten already today? How many calories have I consumed? Am I going to hate myself after eating this pie? Am I going to feel really guilty about it? And all of a sudden, it's like all of this huge emotional weight that's come bubbling up within you, and it's become a lot bigger deal than it ever should have been. Because you're waiting until the moment to make what could be an emotional decision. So just as an example, instead of just saying generally, hey, I want to eat better, maybe you could say something like, I'm going to cut out sugar, or at least cut back to a very specifically defined ruling or parameter for my sugar intake. Because all of a sudden, there's a lot less thought involved because the decision and the parameters have already been set before you come into that decision. And of course, this is not just applicable for food things. I mean, apply it to anything. What about time? The way that you structure your time. I assume most of you probably have something on your phone that will tell you at the end of the week, this is how much time you spent on your phone this week. The screen time app. Have you ever looked at that and been terrified of what you see? It's like, what in the world was I doing this week? Did I really spend that much time on average each day looking at my phone? Really? But could you imagine at the beginning of your week, like laying out a schedule and starting to pencil in different things and saying, all right, this week I'm going to pencil in like 30 or 35 hours of staring at my phone and another 20 hours of watching the TV. That's what my schedule is going to be. No, if you started to do that, you would probably feel really bad about it. But by the time we come to the end of the week, that's exactly what's happened. That's the time that we've spent in those different areas that don't really give us all that much. So whatever it is that you are trying to accomplish in your self-control journey, be specific about it. Specify the parameters before you have a difficult decision to make. And something that will go right along with that, form good habits, the things that you do unconsciously. But even before you start to form positive good habits, I think the Bible would teach us, be extreme about getting the bad habits out. Over in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus uses what is a very extreme illustration to demonstrate this principle. In Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 29, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off, cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Whenever I lived in Auburn, I, on a weekly basis, got to go to a jail. And I got to visit with different prisoners there. I would go to different cell blocks and have Bible studies with them, like a group of 30 or 40 guys. And I would often use this illustration when talking with them about how our life is like a hole. It's like a void. And while they're there in jail, many of them wanted to make things right. They wanted to get all of the dirt out of their life that had got them in there in the first place. And so they would have this specific time in jail without all of these distractions to have a Bible, to grow, to get better. And they would work really hard to dig all of the dirt out, all the things that got them there. But so many of them, whenever they left and they got back out into the real world, they wound right back up into prison. They were reincarcerated. It's because although they had spent so much time digging the dirt out of that hole, when they got out, they did not make a specific, intentional effort to start putting good things into their life. And so what easily happens, even though you work so hard to dig that dirt out, guess what? It slides right back in if you don't fill it with something better. So yes, the first step is getting all the bad habits out, but we also have to be very intentional about putting the good habits in. And there's a laundry list of different things that you could think about, some of which we'll even be talking about this week. But this is going to be a task. This is going to take time. It's going to take work. It is going to take effort and even some willpower along the way. Because as I said before, self-control is a lot like a muscle, and you have to take it to the gym. But too often, people say, all right, I'm going to form a lot of good habits. You start doing all of these good things, and I'm going to, read a whole bunch every day, and I'm going to pray for an hour every day, and I'm going to do this and that and all of it. And people end up biting off way more than they can chew and trying to throw their limited willpower at all sorts of different buckets, and they just kind of burn out. And so just something very practical to think about. Focus your willpower and the strength that God gives you towards one habit at a time. Build it up, work on it to where it becomes an actual habit, something that you do unconsciously, and then you move on to the next one. Because habits take a lot of time and effort. I heard growing up, you can form a habit in about 2 weeks. Actually, real research that's been done into this says that a habit on average takes around 66 days to form and to stick, depending on what it is. So take the time. Take the self-control muscle to the gym and work out, and eventually it is going to grow stronger. And you're going to be able to have multiple habits in your life. All right, 2 more before we end off, and these are the most important 2 that I could have put here at the beginning, but I saved them here for the end. This one is the most obvious, but also the one that we seem to neglect the most. God has to be a part of this process, or else it's just not going to work. Actually relying on the strength that God gives you. It's by far the most important point. Jesus, when he came onto the earth as God in the flesh, went through a human experience and understood what it was like to have to wrestle with self-control. So not only is God omniscient up in heaven and knows everything, but Jesus as Emmanuel came into this world and physically experienced what a human has to go through. And in Matthew chapter 4, the devil himself is coming to Jesus, and it calls them temptations. And I think they were temptations. I don't think it would have said that otherwise. And Jesus had to face each one of those temptations. So he understood what it was like to have to exert a level of self-control. So Jesus understands, and now he's up in heaven at God's right hand interceding on our behalf. So he knows what we need, knows the help that we have to have. So tap into that. Tap into that power. The very first passage that I read was from Galatians chapter 5, the fruits of the Spirit. That is very intentional language. It is not a fruit of man. The Spirit has to be involved in this process or it is not going to work. This should be the first place that we turn. I've heard people say before, if all else fails, then I'll go to God, then I'll pray. No, you pray and you go to God before all else fails and crumbles down. So relying on God, and to piggyback off of that, rely on this. Rely on your community, the fellow disciples and Christians around you who are having to go through some of the same things. We've already talked a little bit yesterday about fellowship, the benefits of that. But when it comes to certain struggles that we have, I think it's important to have some people involved. You read a verse like James 5:16, confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. This doesn't mean air your dirty laundry out to everyone. But this does mean I think we should have people involved in our life. Maybe it's the elders of this church. Maybe it's a well-trusted friend who has your best interest in heart. But the effective, fervent prayer of a righteous person accomplishes much. And I hope we believe in that. And you see, even outside of a religious setting, how much people need this. Take as an example one of the biggest and most well-known rehabilitation programs in our country, Alcoholics Anonymous, AA. I have known people on a personal level who had to go to Alcoholics Anonymous for something they were dealing with, and they went through that program, and they, I guess you could say, graduated from that program. But even after decades, literally decades of being clean, of not having gone back to whatever it was that got them in there, they still go every single week. And you know why? Because they need that. Because they need that community. The people to help them, to remind them. People who are going through a similar thing that they went through. Proverbs 27:17 says, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. And I hope that can be true for a group like this. That we can sharpen each other, and we can rely on each other, and that we can all, in the end, surrender to Jesus and do that together. A couple years ago when I was in California, I read a book that dealt with self-control. And at the very end of the book, this is one of the quotes, ended off with a question. Are you going to believe that the way of Jesus is more satisfying than the old way? If you believe it, if you really believe it, you will start walking in that new way. You will resist temptation and cultivate holy habits. You will put your flesh to death by the power of God's Spirit. You will fight the good fight. You will stay rooted in divine reality so the fruit of self-control can grow in your life. The way of Jesus is absolutely more satisfying than the old way. You know, at some point, we once looked at ourselves as being free to do what we wanted. But then at some point, we came to Jesus and realized that he had a much greater freedom to offer. A freedom to have self-control. A freedom to stop the attacks of the devil. To be able to do that effectively. And I hope that we will be disciples of self-control. You know, all of our sins, our problems, put Jesus on the cross, and now we have a choice to make. Will we bow to our Lord who is on that cross, or will we bow down to ourselves? That's our choice. So let's pick Jesus. And if we do, I promise you, our future selves will absolutely thank us. And we'll be glad that we made the decisions now that will echo into eternity. If you are not yet a disciple of Jesus Christ, if you're not yet following him and having him be your model and example, I hope you will start to do that. If there is any way that we can help you in that journey, please let it be known. Let's all say and let's sing this invitation song.